and that God had a plan for us, or for me, or for you. So to compensate for the abjection, the subjection, the humiliation, the groveling, we can make you the biggest egomaniac that you want to be because God has a plan for you. And he's ready to consider you as the heart of his creation. To fall for this is to degrade, I began with our ethics and our morality, is to degrade them even further. It's to say that a kind act done for a friend or a stranger can only be justifiable, can only be expected of you if you, or could not be expected of you if you did not hope either for a paradisical reward or a hellish punishment. That's why I call it poison. In our most intimate moments of love and solidarity and friendship, it's offering us either a bribe or a threat. It ruins everything that is part of the integrity of our species. And that's innate in it, no matter how much textual revision you subject it to. And it gives a wholly false impression of how the cosmos and the human species came about. You'll alert me, won't you, when I'm trespassing on the time of the and that we don't have to put up with it. But it isn't a coincidence now that, like my metaphor, my preferred analogy for this is Albert Camus, La Peste, the plague. If you remember the novel, at the end of it, the plague is over. The rats have gone back to the sewers. The city of Iran is healthy again. The bacilli have been banished or cured. But everybody in the city knows that the rats and the bacilli are back in the sewers. They'll always be there. They're ready to come out again, and as the novel ends by beautifully saying, to send themselves up to die again in a free city. You are never free from the threat of fundamentalism and religious fascism because it's always licensed by the original text and by the original misunderstanding, and it will always empower them. 10 years ago, I wouldn't have needed to write this book or wanted to, but today, try me. Try yourself. Turn a page of the newspaper. In Iraq, a cradle of Mesopotamian civilization, the parties of God are set on a wreckage of the whole civil society. They would rather beggar and kill everyone than allow it to become a federal democracy, or even to experiment with it. His Holiness the Pope, I have to say something about him, says AIDS may be bad in Africa, but condoms are worse. People in this society say we insist on the stultification of our children by the teaching of pseudo-science. The Iranians have a tooth fairy god called the 12th Imam, a ridiculous, preposterous invention of an apocalyptic kind, and which we wouldn't have to care about except for late-night comedy, except that the same people who believe in this have managed by piracy to acquire an apocalyptic weapon to ram the lesson home. It's said by religious people to me that I must be a seeker, and that if I don't care about God, he cares about me. I turn it back on them. I say, you may think that you lived in a country, a society, a period emancipated from theocracy and superstition and barbarism, but you don't. These people are coming after you too, and it's time you woke up to it. Thank you.
Well, I certainly share Christopher's distaste with religious fundamentalism of any type, and I certainly do worry about American democracy and the threat that the very real threat they impose to it. But I think he's conflated religion with tribalism, and I think Hitchens sees only one form of religion, the chauvinistic, the bigoted, and the intolerant brand that was embodied in the idiotic pronouncements of figures such as the late Reverend Jerry Falwell or Pat Robertson. He assures us in his book that religion spoke its last intelligible or noble or inspiring words a long time ago. It may speak about the bliss of the next world, he writes, but it wants power in this one. Religion is a product of the bawling and fearful infancy of our species, and all attempts, he assures us, to reconcile faith with science and reason are consigned to failure and ridicule. It's easy, increasingly popular, to attack this childish belief system. But by doing this, we refuse to deal with the nuances and depth of religious faith. Hitchens ignores in his book the great moral and ethical struggles by theologians and religious leaders such as Tillich or Karl Barth, who have attempted to root religion in contemporary society. He never confronts the anguish faced by millions of believers around the world who recognize the impulses we carry within us for evil as well as good. And I think he's unequipped to deal with religious belief, trying vainly to argue against its authenticity. He writes in his book of Dr. Martin Luther King that in no real as opposed to nominal sense was he a Christian. He disparages the faith of Abraham Lincoln and assures us that Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the Lutheran pastor who was put to death by the Nazis for resistance, was the product of a religious belief that had mutated into an admirable but nebulous humanism. This is a cheap way to avoid the harder task of exploring the wide range of religious experience, of examining the motivations and beliefs of those who come out of a religious tradition and strive to live the moral life. He's determined to demonize religion, and he would have us believe that self-professed religious leaders such as King or Bonhoeffer were not really religious. And in this, he is in fact an ally of the very religious bigots he denounces. The sophistry of this argument mirrors the sophistry of those who misuse the Bible to champion Genesis as the factual account of creation and to persecute homosexuals, Muslims, women, artists, intellectuals, and those they brand with a curse of secular humanist in the name of God. The problem is not religion. The problem is religious orthodoxy and the form it takes in human institutions. Most moral thinkers, from Socrates to Christ to Francis of Assisi, eschewed the written word. Once moral teachings are written down, they become, in the wrong hands, codified and used to enforce conformity, subservience, and repression. Writing freezes speech. George Steiner calls this the decay into writing. Language has turned from a living and fluid form of moral inquiry to a tool of bondage. The moment the writers of the Gospel set down the words of Jesus, they began to kill the message. There is no room for prophets within religious institutions, indeed within any institution. For as Tillich knew, all human institutions, including the church, are inherently demonic. Tribal societies persecute and silence prophets. Open societies tolerate them at their fringes. And our prophets today usually do not come from the church, but from our artists, poets, and writers who follow, as I believe Socrates and Jesus did, their inner authority, an authentic religious impulse. Those who deform faith into creeds, who use it as a litmus test for institutional and personal fidelity, root religion in a profane rather than a sacred context. They seek, like all who worship idols, to give the world a unity and coherence it does not possess. They ossify the message, and once ossified, faith withers. There are many theologians, including Tillich, Barth, and Reinhold Niebuhr, who brand the version of religion Hitchens attacks as idolatry, as false and dangerous. And he's right in going after this form of belief. He's wrong in assuming that it is religion. What he fails to acknowledge is the supreme importance of the monotheistic traditions in creating the very concept of the individual. This individualism, the belief that we can exist as distinct beings from the tribe or the crowd, and that we are called on as individuals to make moral decisions that at times defy the clamor of the tribe or the nation, is an important gift of the Abrahamic faiths. This sense of individual responsibility is coupled with the constant injunctions in Islam, Judaism, and Christianity for a deep altruism. And this laid the foundations for our open society. This individualism is the central doctrine and perhaps the most important contribution of monotheism. We are enjoined, after all, to love our neighbor, not our tribe. This empowerment of individual conscience is the starting point of the great ethical systems of our civilization. The prophets, along with Jesus, helped institutionalize dissent and criticism. They initiated the separation of powers. They reminded us that culture and society was not the sole prerogative of the powerful, that freedom, and indeed the religious life, often required us to oppose and defy those in authority. This is a distinctly anti-tribal outlook, Immanuel Kant built his ethics upon this radical individualism, and Kant's injunction to always recognize that human individuals are ends and do not use them as mere means runs in a direct line from the Christian Gospels. Karl Popper rightly pointed out in the first volume of The Open Society and Its Enemies, when he writes about this empowerment of the individual versus the crowd, that there is no other thought which has been so powerful in the moral development of man. These religions, in a very real sense, set free the critical powers of humankind. Believers in the Bible and the Quran were called to embrace an abstract, universal deity. This deity could not be captured in pictures, statues, or any concrete, iconographic form. God exists in the Word and through the Word, an unprecedented idea in much of the ancient world that required the highest order of abstract thinking. In the beginning, the Gospel of John reads, was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This is why the second of the Ten Commandments prohibits Israelites from making concrete images of God. Iconography thus becomes blasphemy, Neil Postman wrote, so that a new kind of God could enter a culture. God, as Hitchens notes correctly, is a human concept. God is the name we give to our belief that life has meaning, one that transcends the world's chaos, randomness, and cruelty. To argue about whether God exists or does not exist is futile. The question is not whether God exists. The question is whether we concern ourselves with or are utterly indifferent to the sanctity and ultimate transcendence of human existence.